With the release of Mavuika's kit details, I've seen so much speculation about her and whether she power creeps Xiangling or not, how her kit functions, and if she's even good at all, which I'll hopefully clear up in this video. Hello there, Flip here, and today we're going to be talking about the Pyro, Archon, Mavuika's initial theory crafting prospects, mostly going over how her team works and her synergies. But before we do that, as always, if at any point during the video you're entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing, as I talk on various topics regarding Genshin's meta and I'll try to keep you updated. Shout out to all my lovely channel members, I appreciate your support, and with that, let's begin. Mavuika is of course a 5-star Pyro unit who wields a claymore. Who would have thought? And similar to Raiden in a way, she seems to have a split playstyle that you can either use her as a support, or slap your meat on the table and show your superiority by making her an on-field DPS. This is highlighted through her elemental skill that has two variants, both a tap and hold one. Using either of the skill variants will immediately give you 18 Night Soul points, which is her limit, and will make her enter a Night Soul blessing state. To go into more detail, the tap variant of her skill will summon rings of fire that will track and attack nearby opponents once every 2 seconds. That is literally all it does. This isn't as much pyro application as people thought we would get, but it seems to still be an unconditional pyro application source that happens once every 2 seconds that will follow the player and track and hit multiple different enemies. So that still is really not that bad. There aren't that many teams where you need as much pyro application as Xiangling will provide, but this does make some teams not possible with her, which I'll cover after going over the rest of her kit. So hopefully this gets changed in the future to be a lower interval, maybe like 1.5 seconds, and hopefully they also don't give this ability standard ICD, because if it has standard ICD, then that means Mavuika is applying pyro once every 4 seconds and she's a dead unit in that case. I doubt Hoyoverse would do that, so I'm just going to go under the assumption that every time she attacks she applies pyro, and it is indeed once every 2 seconds. Now for the hold variant of her skill, as I guessed, Mavuika will hop on her motorcycle that enables every Natlan exploration mechanic, and then her normal charged and plunging attacks are going to be converted to motorcycle hits. I don't know what is going on in Genshin, and she can also run people over, I'm not kidding. If you sprint into enemies, you'll deadass do pyro damage and run people over. I don't know what this game has become. Both variations of her skills durations are tied to her Night Soul points, where you're going to be continuously losing points. On-fielding her will cost more Night Soul points obviously, but as of now we don't have any information on how quickly her Night Soul points deplete. Her skill cooldown is 15 seconds, so at the very least I do expect her to have 100% uptime for her skill, so expect at least 15 seconds of off-field pyro, which would be longer lasting than a C6 Xiangling, which is 14 seconds. As an on-field damage dealer, I'm honestly not that interested in this playstyle, as we have so many already, but I've seen a lot of calculations by a lot of reputable theory crafters, and Mavuika is able to do as much raw damage as Arlecchino, and she can do this while having better AoE and also being able to be healed. Yeah, and her skill damage is no slouch either, as she's able to output similar amounts of damage to a Bennett buffed Xiangling, which is kind of nuts for an off-field unit that doesn't need to build any energy, and she's able to match this amount of damage with just a scroll buff. This also means that she doesn't need to take time in Bennett's circle, and for characters like Muolani who are using support Xianglings with infinite ER, then Mavuika is going to be significantly out-damaging her in those cases, which is amazing. On the topic of building energy, remember how much you all hate Xiangling's insane burst cost of 80? Well, how about you just don't have one? I am not joking, Mavuika doesn't have a burst cost at all, and will be able to burst when your party accumulates something called Fighting Spirit. Fighting Spirit has a cap of 200, but you only need 100 Fighting Spirit to burst, and the ways in which you generate Fighting Spirit is going to be 1-to-1 with the amount of Night Soul points your entire team consumes, or you get 1.5 when a normal attack hits an enemy. Now for what her burst actually does, it will first generate 10 Night Soul points, putting her in her Night Soul blessing state, deal an instant of AoE pyro damage, and make Mavuika enter an enhanced burst form similar to Raiden. In this state, she no longer consumes Night Soul points for 7 seconds, has increased resistance to interruption, and her damage is increased based on the amount of Fighting Spirit she has. So literally Pyro Raiden. Even as a support, you do still want to burst every rotation with her, as the initial hit is almost half of her total off-field damage, and because of her Ascension 4 passive, that will give you a damage bonus based on 25% of her Fighting Spirit at the time you cast her burst. So if you cast her burst at 200 Fighting Spirit, she will give you a 50% damage bonus, and if you cast it at 100 Fighting Spirit, then she gives you a 25% damage bonus. It's important to note that this damage buff, unlike Furina, deteriorates over time. It is a front-loaded buff, and over the next 20 seconds you will slowly lose damage percent. Her elemental burst also has an 18-second cooldown, which is whatever. You can play rotations that are 2 seconds shorter than Xiangling ones, which can be nice for some characters I guess. Also, just to make it clear, just because you burst every rotation does not mean that you need to stay on field with Mavuika. You can just cast her skill and burst for the buff and swap off. And for Mavuika's last passive talent, or well her first one, it will increase her own attack by 35% for 10 seconds when a Night Soul burst is triggered. Now let's just get the elephant out of the room. It's going to be somewhat difficult to get her maximum burst Fighting Spirit every rotation, depending on the team. Though even then, I think people people are exaggerating how bad this is. For some reason, people just randomly decided to assume that she starts with 0 fighting spirit when you load up the Abyss, which makes absolutely 0 sense. Like with literally every other elemental burst in the game, I'm going to assume that you start an Abyss run with 200 fighting spirit, otherwise Hoyoverse is just stupid. So with the assumption that you do start with 200 fighting spirit in the first Abyss chamber, then the situation isn't as dire, because as a support you can start your rotations by using your tap skill and burst, which by the time your burst is ready to be cast again will give you a baseline fighting spirit count of 80. You will need at least 100 to burst again, so your options are either to use a Natlin teammate or a character that normal attacks frequently. To start with the Natlin teammate examples, when using a character like Shilonin, her skill and 2 normal attacks will immediately give you 90 points. Technically 93 because of the 2 normal attack hits, but let's just focus on the consumption for now. So combined with Mavuika, that is a guaranteed 170 every rotation, which is going to be more than enough to burst. Mualani consumes 100 Night Soul points over her rotation, so without any external support, that is going to be 180 on Mualani teams. Shaska consumes 80, so that is going to be 160 in her case. And with Kinich, it depends on if you do 4 cannon shots or 5, which will consume 80 to 100, so you can get 160 to 180 for Kinich teams. So pretty much if you have a Natlin teammate of any kind, you are kind of just set to very comfortably burst every rotation. And if you're using Mavuika as your only Natlin teammate, then from the base 80 you need to consume 20 more points or do 14 normal attacks on any of your characters. Someone like Chlorines does 39 instances of normal attack damage, making her generate 58.5 fighting spirit for Mavuika, so overall that's 138.5. Pretty much any normal attack damage dealer that does more than 14 hits is going to be set, so characters like Risley, Arlecchino, Wanderer, and so on. All this to say that she's perfectly functioning as an off-field unit that won't take up too much field time, so she doesn't run into Raiden's issues if you want to use her as a support. Now, before getting into Mavuika's team building, one thing I need to mention is the fact that there's apparently no new artifact set in 5.3, which is kind of bad as her kit just doesn't work well with the artifact sets we have. Her elemental burst state makes it so that she doesn't consume any Night Soul points, and therefore Obsidian becomes very awkward, as even if you use your skill prior to using her burst, you don't have enough duration on it for it to buff her entire burst damage window, making it very awkward for DPS Mavuika. And then for the scroll set, the 2-piece effect literally doesn't even work with her kit. It wasn't designed with her in mind, but even then the 4-piece effect is so broken for both her damage and support that it still ends up being her best option. The problem is that a lot of other Natlin supports are competing for the set, making characters like Kachina, Shilonin, or Roron have to fight for it. Since Mavuika still buffs regardless and does high off-field damage, it seems the best currently to just let the other supports use the scroll set, while she can hold on to a more damage-oriented set like Obsidian Codex, 2-piece, or just Golden Trope. Anyways, let's just move on to our teams and Synergies, starting with the Shark Girl. And if there really is no new artifact set, then Mualani teams are going to be very awkward, as you're either running something like Scroll Mavuika and Instructor Shilonin, or you're running Mavuika on another damaging set like Golden Trope or Obsidian, like I just said, and then Shilonin can use the scroll set. And from here, your options are actually kind of limited. You can maybe run Candace or Yelan, but because Mavuika applies Pyro once every 2 seconds, any additional Hydra application makes forward vaping very unstable. But with someone like Xiangling, she applies more Pyro from her Pyronado, and also has Gobo, which is what makes this more accessible. We just have to wait to see gameplay leaks before coming to conclusions on this. Burn Vape teams would also be really weird, as you can no longer get a Pyro scroll buff past the first rotation if you're using Emily. Kazuha and Sucrose also can't really be used effectively, as most of their benefit is from being able to utilize Goba's Pyro infusion for Viridescent setups. So because of all the hoops you would have to jump through, I can just see Xiangling still being the preferred option for Mualani teams. Adding in Mavuika is an upgrade when using characters like Yelan, Candace, or Mona, but currently it just seems very awkward with her slower Pyro application and her fighting with Shilonin for the scroll set, to where I can see people just not wanting to play it. Now, someone I do think is going to benefit a whole lot is going to be Kinich actually. Mavuika should give you better uptime while doing more damage than Xiangling while not needing to be snapshot, and also finally being able to get a full scroll buff for Kinich. This does mean that most likely you're going to have to run Emily on Deepwood in his teams, but that really isn't the worst thing ever, as Deepwood is still an amazing set for Emily's damage anyways. And it doesn't have to just be Emily, you can slot in other characters like Furina on this team as well. There is still some issues on Kinich teams, however, if you're playing a pure burning team with Emily, as unless a new enemy comes into play, you will lose your scroll buff as you can't trigger burning again on an enemy that is already burning. But for any type of content besides bosses, this shouldn't really be that big of a deal, as new enemies will spawn in, so you'll be able to trigger burning again. For Chaska, unlike what was expected, she doesn't really do anything for her. You aren't going to replace Bennett on her teams, you just lose too much damage, and doubling up also doesn't offer that much considering you lose a bullet, compared to running a rainbow team that includes a Roron or even just Ceaselolly, who are just looking to be better slots currently. And the last Natlin damage dealer to talk about is going to be Mavuika herself. I didn't expect them at all to tune her numbers in a way that made her one of the best damage dealers in the game, but here we are. As I said before, I haven't done any too in-depth calculations as this is just a first impressions video, but from the little I've done and from what I've seen from other theory crafters, her damage is on par with Arlecchino's, but it's going to be slightly more conditional as you need to build up her burst. You're going to need an Alan support in which her choices are Auroron, Shalonin, or Seatlolly. All of her teams are going to just use Bennett, attack scaler moment. If you're planning to play Auroron, you want to use Chevru's teams like so. If you want to play Seatlolly with her, then you want to do forward melt setups which can slot in Shalonin or Kazuha as your last slot, or you can play some funky melt vape teams. As long as you bring Shalonin, you can run a ton of different mono pyro teams as well, which is nice. She is overall just a very fucking strong and flexible damage dealer. And this video is already running on way longer than I expected, and I still want to have my Seatlolly video out later, so I'm going to be speeding through her other use cases and cover them more in depth in a future video. She's going to be best in slot for Clorin's quick burn teams and is going to be a great slot in Chevru's teams. She's also going to be an upgrade in mono pyro teams as an off-field unit over Xiangling. She can also be used effectively with Risley for burn melt or reverse melt teams, though we have the new Mavuika problem to where she's potentially applying Pyro for such a long period of time that for your second rotation and onwards you may not be able to get the cryo scroll buff again, which would suck. And this seems to be a common trend for a lot of her teams. There's also a potential use for Wanderer teams, but this would just be a downgrade to characters like Yulan or Farina, so I wouldn't recommend it. And lastly, she can be used very well with Navia with Shalonin, doing about the same amount of damage as Xiangling while not taking any time away from Bennett's field, and also further buffing Navia. And those are the teams off the top of my head I can think of. If you have teams you want me to look into, I can, so let me know down below in the comments. With all of this in mind, I think it's safe to say that Mavuika is a very strong unit, being able to be one of the strongest damage dealers in the game, and a better Xiangling in most teams that aren't centered around her personal damage. Her kit still currently has its flaws, mostly her supportive capabilities, due to the lack of access to another good artifact set and the fact that her pyro application is not as good as Xiangling's, which can potentially hurt some Mualani teams, and also just getting the right scroll buffs past your first rotation. Now for my personal thoughts, I don't really like her kit. I wish they gave her defensive utility like damage reduction or interruption resistance to the active character. I don't understand why they felt the need to make her such a good damage dealer when Arlecchino basically just came out, and Linny was also in Fontaine as well as Gaming. Mavuika kind of just diminishes the value of all pyro damage dealers by being able to both support and deal damage with the least amount of gameplay issues for an on-fielder, as she doesn't have a cringe playstyle and can be healed while also having increased interruption resistance. I don't know, I wish they would just lean more into her off-field utilities. But with that, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on Mavuika, as I'd love to hear it and I respond to almost every single comment. Channel members, I love you and appreciate your support. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.